All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our community conversation this evening. My name's Michelle Dellariva, and I'm the Executive Director at Community and Family Resources. And I'm also very excited to be the chair for our opioid task force here in Ames. It's really for Story County. Our task force has been meeting for the last 18 months. What we really have been focusing on is looking at what are the community needs and what we can do to help educate the community about the opioid epidemic. So tonight, we have a speaker that is going to be here to tell us a bit about the epidemic, what's going on in Iowa. So we're excited for that. At the end, I also want to invite any of you who are interested in joining our task force. It's open to the community. So our next meeting is on October 8th at 9 o'clock, and that is at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. So you can feel free to ask me about that at the end. But with that, we have Peter Komendowski from the Partnership of Drug-Free Iowa here to present for us. During his presentation, each of you have been given a card. Feel free to write down any questions that you may have for the presenter. Those questions will be collected by Natasha and Barb. I don't know where Barb is at. She might be at the top. So just raise your hand with the card, and they'll collect those, and we'll bring them to the front.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? All right, we're going to, most of the time, I like to talk about how to change the world. Grew up in an era where our goal was to make the world a better place. And for a large part, many of us did make a strong attempt. But sometimes, as is the case now, where we have an opioid epidemic, we have a bit of a crisis in social media being a dominant force in people's lives, and their sense of compassion and understanding is sort of being drained out of interactions between people. And we probably have another epidemic forming on the future in terms of the basically highly unregulated dispensing of marijuana and the potential for it to become legal. So we have all of these energies going in this world. And at this point, making it a better world somehow takes a backseat to healing the world. So most of what we're talking about is a healing journey now, a way to not only contend with the opioid crisis, but find ways to heal it. I can tell you a number that I'll bring back again. It's frustrating for those of us in the business of healing to see that last year, in 2016, we had 64,000 Americans die from opioid and related heroin overdoses. This last year, for 2017, that number is now 72,000. It's a 12.5% increase. We've been within the throes of this crisis for 15, 20 years, and we're not making real great progress. So the purpose of meetings like this is to try and talk about ideas, understand the mechanics of these kinds of social changes called epidemics, and find a way to make every person in the room viable in terms of stimulating change through whatever means you're best at, whether it's through compassion, education, treatment, prevention. Hopefully something in the information we share resonates and empowers you to do better at the things we need every one of us in this room to do to help deal with the threat of not only the opioid epidemic, but any other type of substance abuse and high-risk behavior epidemic we face in America. So to get the ball rolling and cut down my words, there's a wonderful show called Market to Market on Iowa Public Television. I was a guest along with some other people on a show about the opioid crisis in rural Iowa. It's actually airing again with some new sound bites tomorrow night at 8 o'clock on Iowa Public Television. But let's take the 5.5 minutes to watch this episode because it does an excellent job of sharing information with you that might take me a half hour.
What do you guys got? Possible overdose. There's some stuff sitting on the table there. Can you wake up for me?
I think the best definition of addiction that I've ever heard is an irresistible urge to perform an irrational act. An irresistible urge to perform an irrational act.
Over 2 decades ago, painkillers derived from synthetic morphine were seen as a miracle drug for patients coping with chronic pain. Since then, numerous forms of synthesized narcotics have made their way into doctors' offices and pharmacies. According to the Centers for Disease Control, As the number of opioids increased, so did addiction rates. The Trump administration has declared the problem a public health emergency.
They hit people with suits, stresses, indiscriminate. But because the perception of risk were down, it was like inviting the drug dealer to your child's birthday party. You know, they were just handing them out because it was supposed to be thought of as a good thing.
In 2015, the CDC reported over 33,000 deaths nationwide related to opioid overdose. Over the past 2 years, that number has more than doubled.
Last year, we lost over 64,000 people in America. That's more fatalities than the average number of servicemen lost during World War II. So if somebody does not want to call this a war, I don't know where you get 64,000 Americans dying from heroin and opioid overdoses. Not ever be a problem.
Make up for me, dear.
Those developing the strategies to fight opioid misuse are fighting a war on two fronts. One is availability. Officials with the Iowa Governor's Office of Drug Control Policy are concerned medicines like Percocet, OxyContin, and other fentanyls have a safer persona than illicit drugs. Komendowski believes that safer persona creates a climate for addiction. The other front is the amount. Federal government officials contend, with a perception of low risk, opioids have been prescribed in ample amounts with little concern for misuse. Making physicians aware of how many pills are being written into prescriptions is one way opioid misuse is being confronted.
Previously, you'd see a prescription come in maybe for 60 tablets. Now we're seeing more prescriptions written for 30.
As a licensed pharmacist
Bring that with you.
and legislator in the Iowa House of Representatives, John Forbes uses his unique position to help craft legislation aimed at helping curb opioid misuse in rural Iowa. But Forbes knows he and his colleagues on the other side of the pharmacy counter are on the front lines of fighting the epidemic.
Pharmacists just need to be vigilant whenever they have a prescription presented to them that they have questions about.
A tool pharmacists use when a suspicious prescription comes to their attention is the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. Established in the 1930s to track Schedule II narcotics, the program has evolved to an electronic database stretching coast to coast.
We check that database on new prescriptions, especially patients that are new to our pharmacy, to make sure they're not doctor shopping or going to multiple pharmacies to try to obtain controlled substances.
Last year, the Drug Enforcement Administration stepped in to help slow the opioid epidemic by allowing pharmacies to partially fill prescriptions.
A program like this helps keep larger quantities of opioids out of the system, so there's less chance for diversion.
Let's go ahead and give that Narcan. Verified.
A life-saving drug helping addicts who have overdosed is a medication called naloxone or Narcan. This product can bring someone out of an overdose in minutes, but it also has a high price tag.
Narcan going in at $15.07.
One dose can cost up to $100, which can strain small-town budgets. And it comes with one important caveat.
It's an opportunity to treat and care for somebody, to intervene. It's not a cure. And that's the biggest misconception we see with naloxone.
One place that treatment and care can be found stretches over a 7-county area in north central Iowa. Prairie Ridge Integrated Behavioral Health Care in Mason City. It's a treatment center exploring new ways to help people cope with addiction, combining mental and physical health services with recovery treatment. The center uses state-of-the-art technology and strong doses of compassion to help shrink misuse disorders in rural Iowa.
That's the thing we have to keep working on, is to make substance use and mental health treatment part of our healthcare system, not something that's viewed by the public as a weakness or a moral failing. It's a biochemical brain disease, and it's really time that we focus on that as opposed to an act of willpower or lack thereof.
And when the consequences hit American culture anywhere, low population, rural areas where the density is low, they have the least amount of health care, the least amount of counseling, the least amount of resources for public safety. They're at risk for much longer than where we can apply all the big money and resources.
Hey, what's your name?
Officials in the Hawkeye State see a long fight ahead that will require a balance between limited funding and scarce resources. They also believe to win the war will demand an increased respect for the medicines being prescribed. For Market to Market, I'm John Torpy.
As you can see, it's a huge problem. I apologize for slides like this one that I really need to update for 2016 or 2017 because the numbers are bigger. We have accomplished very little. Because keep in mind, for 72,000 deaths last year, that leaves behind orphans, parents without children, children without parents, grandparents having to care for children. It affects hundreds of thousands of people. And if we're losing that many people to fatalities in a year, here are some of the cumulative numbers based on different type of drug deaths. Of course, the number's higher again this year. We're having a significant breakdown in the social networks that have to care for all of these victims of casualties and casualties themselves. So we look at the rising level of overdose deaths. And really, we have to look at the opioid crisis as an opportunity at this point. It sounds slightly dysfunctional, but the fact is, if this isn't a wake-up call for our culture to begin to do something about the way we dispense and use drugs, about the way we represent medicines that are real medicines being misused, and the way we represent things that are not real medicines, like marijuana, that are being abused, we are going to see epidemics like this raging that may not always be fatalities, which is something opioids and heroin are very good at. But the erosion of human values, human potential, and human health is undeniable in any instance when you're using psychoactive and physiologically debilitating drugs. Drugs that are very valuable for people in very extreme circumstances or very narrow niches of treatment, but not, as we're learning from the opioid epidemic, something that can be applied like a miracle treatment to everything. It's important to note, and this is a good day to talk about it this way, is we are mobilizing the east coast of the United States for a tropical storm, a hurricane, something that we have no control over. We don't create them. No insult to any climatologist, but we don't essentially create a storm. And contrary to the fake media, it was not created by China to penalize Trump for tariffs. It's something that happens naturally. We're spending billions and billions of dollars to avert disaster. And yet with 72,000 casualties, we are not on a scale and order of magnitude with the potential loss of life anywhere near that with the opioid crisis. Something is not working. And this is the scale. I mean, these are some really nice numbers, right? The only conflict globally that we could ever recognize that had more fatalities annually was the Civil War, for the simple reason that we counted fatalities on both sides of the conflict. So this is huge. In the order of magnitude of cultural anthropology and sociology and history, we are killing an immense number of Americans, way more than any terrorist could even touch in this country. And that drug problem puts Iowa in a very precarious place because we've seen not only a migration, an epidemiology of growth from the dense population centers in eastern United States and some in the western United States and southern United States, but we've seen the problem migrating across the country. It's not the fact that Iowans on a per capita basis do that much less in terms of opioid prescriptions. It's that there's a curious relationship between an epidemic and its movement across a culture where, as bad as it is in Ohio this year, in the year before, it's been getting continually worse. As bad as it was in Iowa last year, which is 200 and some reported deaths that are attributable to opioids and heroin, we expect that number to be bigger this year. So in order to understand how that works for Iowans, when we really have suffered less in terms of overall deaths and per capita deaths than other places where the epidemic is much more mature, we have to look at sort of the epidemic as a system, as a natural system and how it operates. First, it established itself in a culture. Now, we could say historically the opioid epidemic established itself when a very opportunistic pharmaceutical company decided to spread bad data, bad research, and bad information about the efficacy of a drug for the treatment of pain, something that's very important to the medical community to treat, and made it a miracle drug. Cures everything. Cures cancer, cures PTSD, cures sleeplessness, and whatever. That broke through a site. I mean, we have a very stringent system with the FDA. We have very, very powerful medical community, and yet somehow this slipped through the cracks. And we'll learn, and this probably will never happen again under the jurisdiction of the FDA, which is probably a good indicator as to why the marijuana industry is working through legislative and other means to bring an illegal product to market by bypassing the FDA, because they're probably trying not to make the same mistake twice. But if we look at the epidemic curve, once it establishes itself, it grows very, very quickly. And we obviously have seen that with fatalities as an indicator with opioids. And then, ideally what happens is either the number of victims diminishes, so less people can die, like the Black Plague or anything else, or there are some cures enacted or procedures changed or behaviors changed, and the strength of the negative response to the epidemic is reduced, and hopefully at some point in time it reaches an equilibrium or there's some kind of a cure. Well, in the process of being an epidemic, 4 basic things happen. First, it attacks a susceptible population. In this case, if you want to look at opioids alone, let's just talk about people with valid pain issues going to a doctor. And then it becomes infectious, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It becomes addicted. A person now becomes dependent upon the drug that's supposed to solve the problem. And we know that opioids are not curative. At that point, we now have a population of people, a percentage of people that are addicted to what was supposed to be a medicine. They're taking the medicine to feed the addiction, not for any other health purposes. And a percentage of those people either recover, exist in some degree of discomfort, or die. Percentage of people that use opioids die. Now, we've talked about, if we look back at a typical curve, you know, an epidemic may start in Costa Rica and Africa, move across the country, fly on an airplane from Asia and be the bird flu. You know, oftentimes they have a single point in a single place where they start. Then they move through a culture. And what we do is we spend time slowing them down through health practices and information and education. But when you propagate an epidemic over and over again, when doctors are dispensing drugs in Des Moines, in Omaha, and every other place, what we have is an epidemic that's being propagated at every epicenter of medical treatment, at least we have for the last 20 years, dealing primarily with the issue of pain. So it's really hard to stop something when it starts everywhere around you. It's almost like a spontaneous combustion, which means as we carry back the issue of curing this problem, we have to not just go back to the source in time and look and say, who is really culpable? Why did Purdue Pharmaceutical and people like that do this? Why didn't the doctors have a better command of this? Well, they're busy. There's new technologies. I mean, we're not saying doctors are bad. They work really hard in a very limited scope. They were deceived. They were fooled. Yet, interestingly enough, we go back to those same companies for cures for addiction, for naloxone, that they charge us for after they created the drug that addicts people. I liken the process that we're going through now, and one of the reasons I believe we are going up in terms of fatalities, not down, is because we're going to the very people that caused the problem and asking them for a solution. So what is it? Buy more meds. Go into longer-term treatment. Yes, these things are essential and important, like medically assisted treatment, which we'll touch on later. But we're finding out that addicts, less than 1% of addicts today, can afford a viable medically assisted treatment program. So what good is it? It's like that Marie Antoinette quote, I don't know what she said, but let them eat cake. We got it, but if you can't afford it, too bad. In a way, we're fashioning the cures right now. It's like asking the fox in the chicken coop, what should we do to reduce the problem of our losing chickens? And the fox is going to say, let's have more chickens. What's pharmaceutical companies saying? Let's create a drug that's curative. Let's give you naloxone to maybe save people and allow for intervention. So we have to start, we know that we are not doing a good job overall of reducing the consequences of the opioid epidemic. And one of the reasons is because opioids are so powerful. There's an epidemic in place for alcohol abuse. We're getting an increased abuse of nicotine with e-cigarettes. But we don't really get excited about epidemics if people don't die. It's not that newsworthy. So now people are really dying, and we're finding out people aren't getting that excited that can solve the problem. But one of the reasons it's so powerful is that the likeness of dependency, there's two graphs here. One's the conservative and one's the more aggressive one. So if you look at data on addiction and opioids, you're going to find that kind of a range. But what you are going to see is not only the efficacy of using opioid medications for more than 5 days, limited for anybody just suffering from general pain. I mean, if you're not in hospice, in end of life, or other situations, it's not very practical for you. The longer you continue to use it, the bigger chance you have of being an addict. So if you're a regular user of opioid pain medication, if you're a grandmother, a mother, a doctor, a lawyer, it doesn't matter who you are. Again, this drug does not discriminate, and it's generally more accessible to people that have good insurance and are employed. And the longer you take it, if you, based on this chart, between 20 and 40% of people that are using opioids from 1 to 3 years are addicts. We have, in America today, somewhere between 1 and 10 million opioid addicts. We'll have better numbers in time. The estimates range in that. I'm sure there's a lot more than 1 million. If it's 1 million, then we're really have a high death rate. If we took opioids off the market, see, what this tells us is the majority of opioid users are not using it for the original intended purpose. But if we don't give them an alternative, other than curing addiction, they're going to keep wanting to go back to the well. And if we took every opioid off the market tomorrow, and I heard a Texas healthcare provider said they were not going to honor prescriptions for opioids anymore, which I think is insane. You still have to allow people to get their 5 to 7 days under certain situations. You have to allow a doctor to do their job. I think Blue Cross Blue Shield in Iowa now is limited to 7 days. That's a good thing. So it's hard to get enough drugs to stay high. But if we took them all off the market tomorrow, what happens when you have several million or a few million Americans dependent on a highly addictive drug that they've indoctrinated into their daily life? They've gone to work, they've raised children, they've gone shopping, just like you and I, and we take away their fix. Their basically white, suburban, middle-class ability to go to a doctor and say, I need more of my pain pills, and my life will be normal, which is on some level a form of an addict. Problem is that when somebody's immersed in addiction, we don't really have great perception about ourselves. So we hear about the deaths and very little along the way. So when we start looking at how the problem started, we start looking at what can we do. And this is where a big part of education and prevention and the messages that you can take home from here are important, because one of the greatest indicators of risk, high-risk behavior in people in general, but especially in youth, is perception of risk. If you think stepping into this spot is going to hurt you, you won't go there. If you think getting too close to a poisonous snake is going to hurt you, you won't get too close. If you think drinking and driving is bad for you, you won't get in the car and drive. But if you don't have that belief, if you think you're all powerful, if you think it's not going to happen to you, it can only happen to somebody else, and your perception of risk is low, and I'm going to show you a chart that if you're young, you might not like the context, but it's good data. It's about marijuana attitudes versus use. That the less risk is perceived through the use of marijuana, the more people trying to sell it to you are telling you that it's good for you, though it's a miracle cure for whatever you need it for, the more likely you are to do it if you believe them. This sounds a lot like opioids 20 years ago. You have pain, great. Forget about the exercise, the weight loss, the ibuprofen. Just take one of these and you'll be fine. Miracle drug. Now, you might say that that's human nature. And really, we're not really good at managing human nature. It's sort of a difficult sort of path to walk. Well, we are good at it. When we looked at cigarettes, and we knew they were bad for us when we were educated, when we had a perception of risk that smoking was bad. Because for those of us that remember when smoking was a fad, when it was cool, when it was relaxing, when it provided a break in the day so you would feel better, You know, we also know that there was a huge amount of people that were saying, my Uncle Joe smoked till he was 100 years old, never heard him. Numbers don't lie. People died. Now, there was a critical mistake with smoking because now we're seeing a resurgence in nicotine consumption in e-cigarettes. Now, when I was with marijuana, the most of the people selling e-cigarettes invested in it from the marijuana industry in California through Chinese producers because they knew that they had to have a delivery system that didn't create smoke. You couldn't roll a joint anymore. You had to get an oil, a paste, a wax, or something else because the world had already aligned itself against smoke. Well, Philip Morris had the highest profits last year it has had in 50 years, I think, in terms of percentage of profit because of the business selling nicotine oils to people smoking e-cigarettes. They learn how to get you. And now we see the highest increase in use of nicotine products amongst youth ever. They're no longer smoking a cigarette, just like people doing weed aren't smoking a joint. But they're starting to use nicotine. So now we have to go back to square one and say, wait a minute, all that stuff we did about cancer and smoke and particulate matter and ingesting all these fumes and all these chemicals, you know, that was not what we were really fighting against. It was part of the battle. The other part was the fact that nicotine disrupts the development of a fetus if a woman's pregnant, reduces your capacity, your brain capacity, constricts your blood vessels, and complicates any number of physiological and medical problems you might have. It's just not a good drug to be out there. Now it's a real popular one. So we're going to go back. That'll be another problem we're going to deal with. It's already coming out. Today in the papers, the FDA said, we might have to take all flavored nicotine products off the market because the highest growth in use of e-cigarettes is now middle school kids, which is crazy. But you know, you may not remember the ads back then. I mean, $9 billion was spent on advertising and promoting cigarette smoking. And then a lot was spent after the cigarette thing to try and stop it. But it used to be cool. It used to be John Wayne. It used to be any number of things. So smoking a cigarette is no longer cool. And so we start taking a look at what moves a society towards habits. Now, we have a lot of innocent people that became opioid addicts. But part of the reason that not just the fact that they were able to get opioids from a doctor for a valid reason, is that somewhere between encountering a problem and intervening and solving a problem, we have not cultured a compassionate enough society to be able to conduct proper interventions and give proper support to people that are facing those challenges. When we see an increase, and I'm going to deviate a little bit just because it all makes sense, when we see an increase in youth bullying, in sexting, in mental illnesses related to depression, self-image problems, so many of these things can be addressed in a compassionate culture where people aren't afraid to deal with them face to face. And a whole lot of social media has created these portals into people's lives that are unmanageable. They don't have human touch, feel, sound. We've taken the sense of humanity out of living and caring for people. So all of that sort of compounds the opioid epidemic too, because people don't know what to believe. So now we look at it historically at Iowans again and take a look at culturally, where have we been with drugs of choice and abuse? Number one in Iowa for adults, it's alcohol. Interesting thing, and you'll see the relevance of this in time. When we were trying to put social hosting laws through the legislature within the last year, we were determined to have them up to age 21. And a really nice person that's now retired from the legislature stopped the potential of that and changed it to 18. So we just basically threw 3 years of youth out the window because his comment to the legislature on the floor of the legislature was, we need to have this at 18 years of age because young men serve our country. That's okay. Not for the alcohol, but they do serve our country. That's important to respect. And when they come back, if they have PTSD, they need to be able to self-medicate with alcohol. And that was the comment on the floor of our legislature that got the age change from 21 to 18 on a social hosting law. That's ridiculous. That person just was not educated. That person believed that self-medicating cures PTSD, just like people are trying to get you to believe that smoking weed cures PTSD or any other thing that isn't involved in some serious medical supervision. So when we look at alcohol, what have they done? I probably don't have to tell you about how bad alcohol is, nor I tell you about how bad cigarettes are, nor how much money people spend on alcohol, or how much advertising goes into promoting beer. So much goes into promoting the consumption of beer that in Atlanta, when they looked at 1,000 fifth graders, over 85% of those kids had a beer preference. A favorite beer was the question. What's your favorite beer? They'd never even tried a beer, but they had a favorite brand of beer. What's important about that? Well, when they drilled deeper and they asked them what their favorite beers were, they got Budweiser, Miller, and then even a 6% for Heineken. And then they looked at the TV ads in prime time for beer. And the percentage of kids that had a favorite beer roughly correlated with the percentage of beer ads. In other words, if there were 60% of the ads were Budweiser, almost 60% of the kids had Bud as their favorite beer. And remember, they use puppies, horses, frogs, all sorts of things to sell beer. They use cartoon characters to sell cigarettes, Camel cigarettes, Joe Camel. Everything targets children. Now, how do you circumvent that? Well, you do what the genius people did from Purdue Pharmaceuticals. They went to somebody you trusted, a doctor, and convinced them, wrongly, through deception, that they could dispense essentially a miracle drug. If they could make their customers happy, they would get more customers and make more money. And what's easier than giving them a pill? And everybody talks to you about that. My goodness, if you watch a beer commercial, they'll say, hey, if you have a Bud at your party, everybody's going to be happy. It's going to be a better party. An active depressant that really has nothing to do with having fun. We're all convinced that somehow we can correlate alcohol consumption with feeling better, cigarettes with feeling cooler, marijuana with being hipper, opioids with feeling less pain. We have to be careful where we get this information. So we have a huge number of people in treatment from alcohol, bigger than marijuana, bigger than opioids right now. And alcohol does its share of killing. And it's important to remember, too, that when we talk with the legislature, we learned a lesson. All of them grew up in a culture where alcohol was considered a rite of passage with very little regard for the drinking age. Most people started drinking early. So we realized it was going to be very difficult to change a legislature that had a strongly ingrained belief that drinking was a rite of passage all children should go through. Personally, I don't agree that anything that's pseudo-suicidal or self-destructive of the human body shares that ability, but somehow we've grown up with that. It's indoctrinated this culture. It may have something to do with billions of dollars of advertising. So now let's go to youth, which is what I focus on. Number one drug of choice for children entering treatment is marijuana. And it's an interesting correlation. We don't have a doctor tell them to do it. Matter of fact, in real life, if you read the paper today, they're having trouble getting any real doctors from the medical saying that any of the marijuana they're trying to get Iowa to be in a business of is doing any good. But they're pretending that they're doctors that will say it's good. But it's pretty hard to go against successful people smoking weed. It's pretty hard to go against the coolness of things like marijuana. Now, keep in mind, this system was circumvented with opioids because somebody was shrewd enough and powerful enough to fool doctors. Alcohol, years ago, probably shrewd and powerful enough to fool the federal government, which had a lot to do with prohibition failing and a lot of other things happening. And maybe marijuana today is going to be the people smart enough to fool our legislator that there's some magic cure-all in that product. Somebody's always tricking somebody. And here's something we have to look at when we get involved in a world where we trust our phones and our computers and people that we don't know and that care about us, that we actually make contact with. Again, there was a lesson here in opioids. Somebody fooled doctors. We trust them. So anybody else trying to get you to do something bad is trying to invoke a sense of trust or belief. Inherently, when somebody is doing that to you, they're inverting a basic sort of social order that we're used to in terms of humans being the top predator in this pyramid. Now, I like to think that humans aren't just the top predator. I like to think they're the top steward of life on Earth, our environment, our health, and everything else. But, you know, to be the top steward, you often have to carry a sword of might. Well, if you start believing what other people say, and now we've learned to unbelieve doctors and opioids because doctors have learned that we got fooled. And they're trying to change. But keep in mind, they still have in their hands millions of addicts that they just can't put cold turkey out there, so they look for things like fentanyl and the internet or heroin on the streets. But when that shift happens, something interesting happens to people, is they are no longer the top of the pyramid. You think about it, it's no different than that zebra was no different than doctors being fooled. No different than us being fooled to think that something's good. But there's something more nefarious. Now, I work with graduate students at Iowa State, and I showed them this, and I said, you know, it's hard for me to find something that sort of created an image for people to understand how disruptive it can be to a social order to allow information that's unfiltered, that's prejudiced, that has ulterior motives, into social circles and lives to help them make decisions, how it undermines human values and ethics. And I had to find something that wasn't bloody, and now I do tick off the Lions clubs when I talk to them, but I'm sort of stuck with that. But they said, we have something worse and more violent and more dangerous to show you about how this order, this sort of change of order in the media disrupts human culture and compassion.
Scooby-Doo crackers.
Scooby-Doo. Do you like those?
Yeah.
Have you ever had them?
No.
How do you know you like them?
I so.
Now, that doesn't seem quite as scary as a lion and a zebra, does it? But think about it. A cartoon character promoting a product that's inherently unhealthy has abdicated from that child the strongest emotion they could share with a parent, grandparent, or somebody else, love. If we're teaching children to love things and stuff before they learn to love people, what's going to happen when somebody tries to fool them? Who are they going to have to talk to? Who are they going to believe in? Who's going to believe that somebody cares for somebody else? And this isn't new. This has been going on forever. At one time, smoking was supposed to be one of the greatest things on earth. I can show you this for alcohol. I can get even, if we're looking into this, the movement of health, wellness, social equality, income inequality, even the sanctity of things like Christmas. These are award-winning ads from when I was a kid. I didn't see them then, but I know they were there then. These didn't offend anybody 50 years ago. I assure you that people historically looking at what we're going through with the opioid crisis, when they look at the next emerging epidemic with tetrahydrocannabinol, marijuana, they're going to say, boy, those people were not smart. Why did they do this? But that's the way of the world. The world changes. And so when there's somebody pitching you, they want something from you. And if they can get it because it creates addiction, just like opioids, if they can get you to love it because they know addiction is a part of its makeup, that's one way to guarantee success. The largest industries in the world, it's alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, drugs of all sorts, all have one major thing in common. Once they get a hold on you, it's extremely expensive and difficult to turn back. And yet they keep trying, and sooner or later we're going to learn how to do this, and we're going to work on things like perception of risk, which is what this begins with opioids. But again, it's not just opioids. We have faced epidemic after epidemic after epidemic of things that challenge our society. In the 60s and 70s, people protested war, indiscriminate corporate growth. Today, we're protesting environmental challenges. We're always going to be looking for what's wrong, but sometimes we forget when we get mixed up that some of the things that we look at to help us might hurt us. So we also take a look at what's happening in America with kids, and when are they learning things, and when are they becoming manifest of being able to make decisions, and when can we help them learn things that'll help them do things better. So that the next generations of children grow up, and when a doctor says, try this, they say, you know, I'm going to use Google, okay, because I'm not against social media. It's a good thing. It's like a hammer. If I build a house with it, I've done something noble. Matter of fact, most of America is probably built with people with hammers in their hands. But if I hit you in the head with it, it's no longer very benevolent. So the potential of even the most innocuous things can be corrupted to evil. You know, we have some great ideas in this culture like, well, let's do this. I like the Ten Commandments. I happen to go to church. I'm raised a Catholic. Live with a Lutheran. I have to live with going to different churches. It's okay. But I like things like thou shalt not kill. When I was growing up and people protested the war, I thought, you know, there's just something inherently wrong with killing people to solve a problem. And I still believe most people believe that today. What I don't understand is how people spend dozens, if not hundreds of hours of their lives playing violent video games where what they practice is killing things over and over and over again. It makes no sense to me at all. But I will tell you, I've tried and played the games with my sons. You know what? They can get you. You can tell yourself you're having fun. You can think, what a great way for the family to do something together around a computer. But when you step back and go, whoa, I'm killing stuff. Maybe not so good. So violent media has a tremendous effect on people. So we start looking at, okay, when does this start changing? We got games killing people. We've got violent TV shows. We've got kids reading about the opioid crisis. We've got all these challenging things to figure out. And the more time they spend on social media, the less time they're dealing with parents, with teachers, with priests, with caregivers. The right people that care about them and love them and live with them face to face aren't in their daily dialogue. And so we go back and look at things like the Iowa Youth Survey. What a trip. Okay, this is social pressure to use substances, which includes things like opioids they steal from mom's or grandma's medicine cabinet. You know, Iowa Youth Survey doesn't do a lot of these anymore. They don't like the way I use their data, but it's okay. You know, they say, look at this. Oops.
I'm hungover
Wait a
from
minute.
video.
No,
I'm hungover from.
Wait.
I'm fried from.
Yeah, hit some bad button there. Let's try this again. They go, wow, this is great. Look what happens with these 8% of sixth graders. By the time we get to 2012 sixth graders, we've reduced that number to 7.5%, or so, you know, from 9 to 7. Well, that's really cool, except by the time they get 2012, they happen to be on that green chart, which happens to be the 11th graders. So somewhere between 8th and 11th grade, huge increase in social pressure to use substances. We'd like to think we're doing a good job in our schools, in our homes, but they're growing up with a mixed message. Now if we look at youth access to substances, 3/4 of kids by the time they get to high school, get into high school in Iowa, know where to find illegal drugs and substances in their communities. I show that number to parents, and it's all not my kids, so I can talk to parents of 1,000 kids in the school district, and probably 999 are going to say, it's not my kids. And I go, well, what 75% is it? These are self-reported by Iowa school kids. And if we get to the norms, the positive student norms, the things that shape their behavior, which, like for an opioid addict, was the doctor said it was good for me. It would help me, which is really hard to change, even when you tell them it's bad for them. And even worse if you don't have an alternative to help them, and almost impossible if they've now become an addict of any one of those drugs. But
I'm fried.
I did it again. That slide really wants to play, and I have a great intro for that. So the social norms actually are, at sixth grade, are so cool. You know, only 5% of the kids feel that it's okay to do any of these sort of negative things, high-risk behaviors. But by the time they get to 11th grade, half of them think it's okay. So if you got younger brothers and sisters, grandkids, children, nieces, nephews, man, work with them on this stuff. Because if you want to stop the next opioid epidemic, the next any kind of epidemic, they need to believe that they can fact find and do information, not be pressured by people, things, or machines, or programs that are constantly trying to take the top of their pyramid away from them and tell them what to do. And I learned something from some grad students and some AmeriCorps volunteers when I was sharing some of the data I did with focus groups with 5th grade children in Iowa. All confidential. I took down comments about their experiences with media. Facebook, World of Warcraft, all these different things they did. And I just say, talk to me about the good comments and the bad comments. Well, the good ones were pretty, I could win, but most of them I said, ultimately, what happened? Well, I got tired and I went to bed. Most of it was not a good thing. Most of it was that they got burned out on it. And these are actual voiced over quotes that came from 5th graders in Iowa.
I'm fried from looking at the internet all day. I'm hungover from video games.
I OD'd on Facebook.
Now, I was focusing on the fact that they were feeling stresses in dealing with social media, having less contact with their kids. And I've already dealt with kids at youth camps in the summer, and I've had plenty of young kids come up to me afterwards and say, do you have any advice? Every time I talk to my mom, she's got her cell phone in her hand. And if it rings, she's not paying attention to me. And I'm so inspired by that, but what it means is we have a younger generation of kids that are looking at their parents like I was, like growing up with a parent that smokes or is an alcoholic. They're starting to see there's something wrong here. They refer to their older brothers and sisters as zombies with blue faces, so there's some hope there. But what was pointed out by the students I was working with a year after I collated this data was, wow, they're using the vocabulary of addiction. And one problem we have with addiction, besides getting people to break out of that third person effect psychologically that says, well, it can affect other people, but not me. Like, well, I can have another beer. I'm okay with it. We've all been there. Is the fact that we never had a model to teach young children, to educate young children about addiction. They knew a mom or a dad that might have had a problem with alcohol, maybe somebody with drugs. But the concept of addiction to a young child, as far as I know, hardly existed in the 5th grade. And now we have 5th graders using that vocabulary to describe experiences with digital media. To me, that became scary because they got those words from the digital media. They didn't grow up with those words. So now they were changing their perceptions. And it's fascinating. And years later, as I was looking at more purveyors of bad things like drugs, I found statements like this that made me wonder what the correlation was between communication, information, misinformation, social media sort of trends, and epidemics of bad information that travel through social media. And I ran into this quote. I'm going to preach a little bit more about social media, and we're going to get into what's happening in Iowa with opioids and what we're doing and how it's working and how it's not working. But one thing I want to say about using cell phones for social media and everything else. I know a study Dr. Gentile did here points out that if you do not access your computer or cell phone for anything during a class, especially a lecture series class, you will average 2 grade levels higher than the person that's accessing their phone even once. So if you want to be a better student, don't look at your cell phone or computer in class. Seriously. It's pretty much a research shows it. But here's something cool. I show this to kids in middle schools. And I say, forget about parental monitoring. Think about it as peer monitoring, because they're starting to get it. Because remember, not everybody's as indoctrinated as us into using phones and computers so much. Young kids are growing up thinking it's icky. More of them are anyway, not all of them. If you lower your screen time, overall, you'll sleep better, you'll get better grades, and you'll be healthier. We have more research that stacks that up that you could ever count. And this stuff, I think, was done by, some of this research was done with Dr. Gentile right here at Iowa State. If you reduce your exposure to violent media, video games, movies, things that are inherently violent, you know they're wrong. You don't need 10 commandments. You will increase your pro-social behavior and decrease your aggressive behavior. Simple. So I get parents say, oh, my kids don't use a computer too much. Well, I tell them what simple research says this. If your kid uses 60 hours a week in media, and the average teen in Iowa uses 54 plus hours a week, of which about 30% of that's multitasking. But if you reduce that by any percentage, 1 hour or 20 hours, you will improve. You'll be healthier, you'll sleep better, you get better grades. Simple as that. If you only use 10 hours, now if you use it just for research, just for writing, for really positive things, you're cool. But that's not the way these things work. So what this says is that we know whether it's an opioid addiction or an addiction to the internet and social media or an addiction to marijuana or addiction to alcohol, there are teachable moments. We want to learn from this. And in America, there's never been a more powerful learning experience. More people die from alcohol-related deaths. But this culture has been so irreverent about caring for that number. They live with it like it's a norm. Well, people are going to die. It's like living in Africa. And, well, some people die from snake bites. Other ones are eaten by lions. In America, people die from drinking. That's just the way it goes. We can do something about it, but we don't do what we should. But they are inherently teachable moments. And we learn that the relationship between opioids, marijuana, and alcohol, and heroin, as you'll see from a CDC chart coming in, are very powerful. So if people tell you that if you use marijuana, it'll help people from using opioids for pain, they are wrong. Not one bit of research supports that. If you're dealing with opioids and they're not doing it for your pain, you need to go look at other protocols, and there were good ones. I will tell you now from talking to doctors, what doctors used to do for pain management before the opioid miracle cure came along worked for a lot of people. It was a little harder than taking a pill. Maybe a lot harder. You had to exercise, you had to lose weight, you had to watch your diet. And maybe use things like aspirin, ibuprofen. You know, if a young child breaks a leg and they have to splint the leg to cure, aspirin actually works better at pain relief than opioids. So the jump to opioids was not rational. In many instances, it's not rational for most people. You don't need to take the highly addictive drugs. Now, stepping back into opioids, the unfortunate part is that the majority of people that become dependent on opioids and opioid addicts were not looking for a thrill. They weren't looking for a high. They're following doctor's orders. We see a huge number of people that have opioid-related issues, young kids, especially athletes, that have a lot of pressure on them to heal fast and get back into the game and not lose a year of eligibility. Now that we're learning that, they're dealing with it a lot differently. Even professional athletes recant plenty of stories of how opioids just about nailed them. Brett Favre, famous one for that. I mean, it contributed to some of his problems. And we know that addiction is not some volitional choice like, am I going to drink rum or vodka tonight? You know, it's actually once this happens, whether it's intentional or by playing risk games, by going out with friends and drinking on a Friday night, or going to a doctor and getting a treatment that you're not managing effectively, once this happens, you're now in the throes of a business which is to provide you with every possible option you'd want to buy. These are all, and many of these have very viable applications. They're not evil. But opioid-based pain medications just don't do the magic that was promised, and we have to find a way to get people off that bus. These numbers are bigger now in terms of daily deaths. Opioid treatment admissions, as you know, are way up in Iowa. ER visits are going way up, and with that, even marijuana-related ER visits are going up, even before we see a lot on the market here. Drug-impaired traffic fatalities are on the way up. All drug and other drug deaths are on the way up. That's when prescription opioid pain medications are going up. We went through this one. Again, we are just good about investing in natural disasters, and we have, we don't know where that storm came from. We know where the opioids come from. We know who dispenses them. If we knew where that storm came from and how it happened, couldn't we just go out there and stop the storm? Well, it's not so easy. It's not that easy with opioids either. But it should be a little bit easier since we can point to the places they actually come from. When we look at what they do to us when we're here, and we look at opioids as a precursor to the use of heroin, interesting. If you're taking opioid painkillers, you're 40 times more likely to become a heroin addict. And if we took all the opioid painkillers off the market, because doctors wouldn't give them to you, I bet that number goes way up, because you're going to need your fix. But what's important to notice is that, before the opioid addiction, if we could take that out of here, those numbers would scare us. The opioid number is just obscene. So what does a market do? Like alcohol, let's make it stronger. caffeine products, make them more powerful. They keep making more opioid type stuff that's harder and smaller. Now carfentanil, a grain of sand can kill somebody. Narcan, it doesn't save lives, it provides an intervention. But you know where it saves a life? Where a public safety officer, an emergency medical person, police officer, anybody out there that comes into contact with something that you almost can't see, a speck of sand that could kill them, we could save their life. They're not an addict. They're not going to be one. But some of the stuff that's hitting the market now can kill you. We have many, many more seizures. We're collecting more of these things around the state. The amount of Narcan being used to help intervene and help people, but it's scary. We get countless stories of EMS people that go out to a rural home, somebody's overdosing, they give them Narcan, and they refuse treatment. And they leave. Because they know the next time they need, they can dial 911, they'll get their Narcan. Now we're working on getting public safety and people involved so that, when there's children at home and stuff like that, maybe we may consider them at risk when this becomes a chronic problem, but it's a major issue. So some of the things we're doing to try and take the drugs off the market that are secondary use, because what happens is drugs get diverted. People buy them, they sell them, they give them to their friends, and then some of these things become black market imitations. Nobody really knows. So we work on things like taking back drugs. So if you're in your community here, they have drug take back. Chuck, you got a place in the county too to return them. Get rid of stuff. If you're done using it, take it there, dump it off. I hate to tell you, when I talk to grandparents and I ask them about how they treated their medications, how many accidental deaths there might have been from grandparents that had opioid-based pain medications that their grandchildren might have taken and died from? There's no number for that. We don't know it. But because we know a large source of opioids were taken from family medicine cabinets resulting in deaths, it's highly likely that population that got prescribed the most had something to do with it. And that's scary. We now have take-back sites all over the state. And we are working on the prescription monitoring program so that people don't shop for opioids. But we're also working, and doctors are on board, to give out less opioids. But again, if most of the people getting the opioids are addicts, we have to find a solution. And we have to increase utilization. If you go to a doctor and they suggest a medication, ask them what it is. Ask them how it works. Ask them if there's a danger. The world has changed. You should now not want to get an opioid medication. And if you have friends taking them, you should be telling them, hey man, you don't want to do this. If I were like a crazy UFO guy and said, man, there's aliens landing and they're killing 72,000 Americans a year, you'd probably go, yeah, right. Well, guess what? The crazy UFO are opioids and heroin, and they're killing 72,000 Americans a year. So if you know anybody, do it. Iowa's done a great job of reducing doctor shopping, but if the doctors aren't getting them to people, every time you do a lot of diverting shopping, you have the potential of somebody going to heroin or buying something on the black market. Oh, tech dude, is that my cue to stop talking? No. So we actually are doing less prescriptions here, and the state has created a bunch of priorities that they're working on to reduce prescribing, to increase prescriber use of prescription monitoring program, to do more intervention, and they're looking at enhanced medically assisted treatment. But it's really problematic because of the expense of that treatment. If we could ask every addict to come up and say, we want to help you, we don't have the money to help them all. In the Philippines, they went really crazy on drug dealers, meth. And they made it punishable by death if a drug dealer resisted in any way. And when they started the program, they killed a lot of dealers, and people were up in arms. So the government said, all right, we're going to put a moratorium on the drug dealers. We'll give them X number of days to turn themselves in, and we'll put them in treatment for their addiction. Because that's where the violence was, the gangs fighting over the drugs and doing the drugs. Well, so many of them did not want to get killed by the cops getting busted, came to the government and said, please help me. The government had to stop and say, we can't help you. We don't have the resources. In fact, America's in the same spot. We have to figure it out. And if we're worried about how quick we are to respond, this is not an old problem. This is a 2009 CDC report that basically tells you that 50% of the most recent poisoning deaths were teens 15 to 19 overdosed on prescription drugs. Most of these were due to opioid painkillers. That was 14,000 15 to 19-year-olds dying. We knew that a long time ago. And we're still having trouble slowing it down. So we've got to be able to do something. I know we want to have some Q&A. I do have a 4-minute clip about that DEA thing, chasing the dragon. You want to play it or you want to go to questions? Hand your questions in. I'll play the clip. And then, because this is a really great video that makes a correlation between other types of drug use and youth behavior and opioid addiction, which blew my mind when I saw these things. These are real. These aren't actors.
Being addicted to opiates is like chasing a dragon. You're constantly seeking that first high. But what's going to happen if you actually catch it? Coming from a great family, you know, always had what I wanted. Never had a curfew. I could sleep over at my friend's house whenever. I could have done anything. They would have paid for me to go to any kind of school, stuff like that, and any kind of, they paid for guitar lessons.
I grew up with my dad. My mom wasn't in my life though. He pretty much was mom and dad throughout the whole life. He would tutor me for at least an hour. On the weekends, we'd go out, we'd go camping, we'd go out on the boats. We always had something planned.
She started in gymnastics when she was like a toddler, and she was a cheerleader through middle schools, high schools, and she was also a competitive cheerleader. She started competing probably in 7th grade. She was a very good student. She was in AP classes, AP honor roll.
Worked myself up through the years with minimal college to a position. I worked as a corporate account executive. Was making about an average of $122,000 a year. Things were pretty good financially. We were secure. Kids were happy. We had no real issues.
Dad was military, mom was Korean. Everyone I grew up with was the same way. Everyone's parents was military and Korean parents, Korean mom. No, I did martial arts, ballet, gymnastics, did all kinds of stuff. I did piano lessons. I was an honor roll student, always went to school. I was like 3.43 grade point average.
I had a great childhood, great family. We did a lot of camping, a lot of fun stuff, going to the beach, camping at the beach. Very active in scouting, Boy Scouts, and something my father, me and him did together, you know, a couple days before my 18th birthday. I actually got my Eagle Scout, which was a big accomplishment for me.
I met my first husband when I was very young. I was 13. And then we got married at 17. So I got to grow up pretty quick. I was 22 years old, and that's when everything started. I got pregnant with my youngest daughter. Once I had her, they gave me Oxycontins. That was the pain medicine. And from then on, that's where my addiction started.
A friend offers you something at a party or at home, or you're having a bad day and you need something to pick you up, so somebody hands you a pill and says, here, this'll help you feel better. That's how this problem always starts.
Cool. Let's go to questions.
Yes. So we have some great questions from the audience. The first question is, what can I personally do as a future health educator to prevent this epidemic? And what would be the best thing out of everything you have seen or done thus far?
Okay. Prevention's tough when we already have an epidemic. So that's a good question. because what we can do is mitigate their side. When there is an epidemic, you have to become a little bit of everything. You have to know how to help people find a protocol to avoid using the drug. You have to understand how to deal with somebody that may need to intervene with somebody using a drug, or you may personally have to. You have to know a little bit about treatment and recovery, because it's already an inherent problem. But if you're going to get ideally into prevention, I think it's to understand that, like again, a teachable moment. We have a lot of data now on opioid addiction. We have a lot more talk about the epidemiological aspects of an addiction spreading through American culture. Because what we see is, remember how I talked about that curve where it starts over and over in every doctor's office? Well, every cell phone with social media has the potential to propagate an idea that can become an epidemic. Might be an epidemic of bad information. When you go into a school, if somebody says something that's of a bullying nature on social media, and that spreads to 500 students, that's an epidemic. So teaching people that they have to be responsible for their actions, compassionate for people dealing with those challenges, I think is really, really important. An epidemic in place, you have to really be willing to look at all the aspects, because you never know what level of that journey you're going to encounter somebody. But to teach people to avoid things that might have long-term bad consequences is to begin to make them good critical thinkers, have them address issues and information with trusted professionals in prevention, treatment, or medicine. Doctors can be trusted. Just because they made a mistake with this doesn't mean that they're very trustworthy, and they've learned well, believe me. So I think inherently that ability to be able to educate people to seek information from reputable sources and trust systems that protect us, whether it's the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or your family doctor, or a teacher, or a resource officer at school, prevention person, a priest, people that have vested interest in your well-being.
All right, our next question. Are opioids only made in the pharmacy, or can they be made by drug dealers?
I think the majority of them that are made illegally are made overseas in other countries. I have not heard of anybody making opioids in their living room or garage like I have of meth. And heroin requires poppies. So I don't think it's being manufactured here, but between buying on the internet and buying from drug dealers, especially the fentanyls and carfentanyls, they're being trafficked pretty easily. Now, whether that'll happen, we didn't think there'd be one bottle of meth labs either. We'd have done something. Who knows what's going to happen? Could they possibly send components? Literally, I think, Chuck, you might even know, somebody was telling me in law enforcement, I think it was the DEA, they seized a bunch of liquid fentanyl, and it was in a water form. It was like water. Nobody knew. No, it had never been trafficked like that before. So somebody could be walking with a water bottle, and they could search them, and they had no idea. So if it's illegal and there's a market, and remember, the market's driven by addiction, whether it's tetrahydrocannabinol, alcohol, opioids, somebody will find a way to do it. But I have not heard of somebody being able to make it in their backyard. But I have heard of people taking viable pills, smashing them up, and mixing them with other things to try and sell them in a capsule as being more powerful than they are to make money. And drug dealers have always been doing that.
Okay. Next question talks about what strategies do you recommend using in the middle school and high schools to help educate the students and combat the pressures to use substances?
That is cool, because what you have in middle schools is a sympathetic audience. That's one thing I've learned. We can have so much confidence in the fact our youth are looking up at us, and they're not really seeing a lot of great stuff all the time. So that's why you think they're going on social media or finding heroes that are Superman or Ant-Man or the Hulk, because they're not finding them in their daily lives. And you can overcome all sorts of hero worship with caring and compassion. And if you understand that these kids in that age, I really believe they're scared. That when they watch the news with their parents, when they hear about these things, everything is so negative and so fearful that if you can help them understand that they don't need to be afraid, that they have the potential to have a different outcome than what they're looking at, because they're really on the outside looking in. I think we have a tremendous opportunity with the knowledge that we've gained from the opioid epidemic and the fact that now everybody, it's not just destitute people, homeless people, that doctors, lawyers, and everybody's subject is. It gives us a great platform to say we have a great way to learn and to teach. So the biggest thing with young kids I see is they're really scared because they think it's inevitable. When they see all this stuff on the news, they just think, when is it going to happen to me? Could you imagine going on a walk in the park thinking an alligator or a lion's going to jump out at you? They were naturalists teaching at Hartman Reserve in Cedar Falls that told me they had a child that had a nervous reaction to a walk in the woods because they thought a lion was going to get them. They brought in the parents, they talked to them, and they said, well, our child should be well adjusted. He doesn't even watch any bad TV. He watches the Discovery Channel and Animal Planet. But what the child didn't realize is that the lions he's watching on TV didn't exist in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Well, so these fears that you're teaching 5th to 8th graders, they see them, they feel as if they're real, and you need to teach them they can be safe, they can go to people to get help, and that they can be protected. And even though they're hearing all these bad things are happening for themselves, they don't have to consider it a norm that they're going to encounter them.
Okay. Next question is, how do we change the approach advertisers are using to attract young consumers?
Ronald Reagan, and it's a wonderful tape, you can find it online. The broadcast, the FCC used to have a ruling that you could not have advertising that affected children in an adverse way for health. I don't remember the exact words. And he spoke before the joint Senate and House committees to strike. Of course, he came from California with acting and stuff. And so they struck those words from the FCC rules. And the seminal comment that I keep hearing that he said was, we can take this out. We really don't need to regulate the advertising industry because the people that run the advertising industry are parents, and they care about kids, and they wouldn't do anything that would hurt kids. So probably we'd have to legislate and change the FCC rules, because at this point, most advertising is really bad. There was a cereal called a Ninja Turtle cereal that was taken off the market because it was the least healthy breakfast product ever sold. And it was the most popular when they promoted it because Ninja Turtles took over the world. So we don't have any rules and safeguards. So here's the cool thing. We don't. That tells you that the more you live in a virtual world, the less safe you are. So who should help you deal with advertising messages? People that you trust, your parents, your friends, teachers, priests, doctors. Kids have to be taught that that's the system of support they need, not in the cell phone or the computer. And believe me, they're not going to the cell phone or computer because they're thinking it's a good idea. They're going there because we aren't giving them the attention that they need, the love they need, the caring they need. We're on our cell phones. We're doing fantasy football leagues. We're playing video games. We're looking at Facebook. Oh, it's good. I'm just selling a few things on Facebook Market. We find excuses for these addictions every day. And little kids growing up aren't getting the attention they need. Most of you in college are hanging out with people that aren't getting the attention they need. They may be home back in their dorms playing video games 6 hours a night. You're doing any number of things. If you know people like that, try and help them. Maybe one of the biggest causes of kids dropping out of Iowa State in the first year, boys especially.
Okay. This question is related to the legalization of marijuana. The question is asking, with death rates going up in states like Colorado and other states making it legal, why do we feel that we're setting Americans up by continuing to legalize it in other states? And I also would be want to add to this question is what type of advocacy could we do with our representatives to help curb this from happening in Iowa? Because we certainly are seeing that also go across the states.
Yeah, do you remember a movie called Jerry Maguire? Anybody see that's an older movie? Tom Cruise movie? Great movie. You know, in sports, they said, if you want to find where something's coming from, follow the money. America is really based on money and greed, bottom line. You know, when the legislature has battles, what is it about money and budgets? When the university is stressed, it's because the legislature cut their budgets. I mean, when hospitals are having trouble providing services, it's really about budgets. So we've began to measure our culture in our accomplishments. You know, oftentimes, I was in a town called Frisco, Colorado, and they banned the sale of medical marijuana. But they said, we'll let them sell recreational marijuana. The reason was, on the city council, there were a couple of doctors. The doctor says, I don't want to be known as the guy that said that marijuana has medical validity. If they want to sell it recreationally, that's fine. But I don't want people saying that me as a doctor said it was okay. And sometimes when we look at this, we think, well, maybe it's inevitable that it'll take over the country. Marijuana proponents want you to believe that. But there's a lot of reason left. Most of the states that have legalized marijuana, especially for recreational and medical, have been referendum states. And this is what nobody tells you and nobody really knows because not everybody studies constitutional law anymore. A referendum state says, if I have enough money to do enough advertising to force a referendum for something, the legislature by those states is bound to enact that referendum. So in Washington and Colorado and California, when the voters were able to do a referendum and the pro-marijuana people could dump enough money into advertising so most of them would say yes to medical or legal marijuana, the legislature has to approve it. Their job is to facilitate it, not to say no. Iowa's not a referendum state. So if the legislators are trying to legalize something that just about everybody in law enforcement, medicine, public safety, and public health, and the CDC, and the AMA, and the FDA are telling you is really not good for you, and our legislature is trying to push it, follow the money. In Colorado, after it was legalized, 3 out of 4 of every major person working in government that crafted the laws and the administrative rules for the marijuana industry went to work in private industry for an average of 4 times the money annually. They feathered their own beds, and there was no law against it. And I learned this from a Colorado legislator who said, I wish we had a law that said, if you help craft the legislation and if you bring this, you can't go work for that industry. I went to our legislature asking for the same thing. They laughed at me. Why would we want to take away their opportunity to better their lives for their families? No chance. So follow the money. I mean, if you want to do something, talk to your legislator. In this state, the legislature has to enact these laws. They are human beings we elect that are responsible for it. Talk to them.
Okay, this is related to the same. Much like opioids still having a place in healthcare, such as having a 4 or 5 day supply after surgery, is there any research that shows that medical marijuana will have a place?
Okay, number one, medical and marijuana do not work in the same sense. Marijuana is a plant that's composed of hundreds of substances. There is an element that's been distilled from the marijuana plant called CBD, which has worked for some intractable epilepsy and other things. It's been approved by the FDA. It's available from doctors by Epidiolex. Insurance companies cover it. It's valid for use. And that's really, if you go back 4 years in Iowa, everybody said, we have to have CBD to save our kids. Well, we got them that through Washington, through the FDA. And now it's like, oh, yeah, no. Now we got to save the veterans. I mean, they've got a whole new shtick going here. Because what they really want is high THC levels. In the last month, the company, MedPharm, that works for Kemet Industries, has been at a town hall meeting saying we should make CBD much more available to people because really the THC that can hurt people is minimal. There's a 3% limit on it. The same week, they're at a cannabidiol board meeting, which is an administrative board for the legislature, saying we can't be in business unless we get more THC. These are documented. It's in KCCI. It's in the Des Moines Register. They lie to whoever they have to lie to get what they want. In order to facilitate it in Iowa, they have to get legislators to do what they want. I'm not saying that every legislator working on marijuana, just like the legislator that said soldiers need alcohol to self-treat for PTSD, that was a really good person that did a lot of good stuff. They are subject to misinformation too. They're subject to not listening to our public safety people, our police officers, our doctors, the AMA. And we need to remind them, by talking to them, that they need to listen to some of these people.
Thank you. Is there a way to control how much narcotic medication is given by the hospitals?
Well, it looks like insurance companies are making the first step. In many instances, by the time somebody's in a hospital, and I'm not talking about outpatient, you're in a usually pretty severe situation. And there are many cases where drugs that we would talk about as being very dangerous here are the choice. And you're under supervision of a doctor and you're dealing with much bigger risks like life and limb. And so they're necessary. So I think that always within the constructs of a hospital, they've been doing a good job of measuring it. It's when people left the hospital. It's when people saw ads on TV that said, take this pill and never feel pain again. You know, there were a lot of other things working. But doctors themselves have always been pretty responsible. It's just that the gate sort of opened for what happened after they were under direct supervision. That answer that one?
Okay, and our last question is what is your idea to stop opioid overdose in the state of Iowa as well as in the United States?
We've heard this, it takes a village. My hope is that if anything comes out of this, you realize, just like if I go to a doctor and I get a prescription for something, and it may not be an opioid. 10 years from now, some other drug may fall through the network. Who knows? That somebody helps me, somebody says, hey, this could be bad. My hope is that today, if you run into anybody thinking about using dangerous and addictive drugs, that maybe is taking opioids, that maybe has gotten a prescription and has half a bottle and thinks I only take them after I play flag football on Saturdays because I have them. If you run into those situations, just do something. Be compassionate, be caring. Most long-term addictions to illegal drugs happen for a lot of reasons. Sometimes poverty, sometimes pain, sometimes depression, sometimes mental health. I believe that some kind of a mental health challenge exists anytime somebody takes a drug that might change the way you think. And I suffer from chronic pain, and I'm a cancer survivor, and I can tell you that just a normal person going through life at times can feel down. And you wish that there was something quick you could do. But there is. You can get up, walk, go to a yoga class, read. There are good choices. But somehow those things that are easy and quick can attract us. So I think ultimately more compassion, more understanding. For a long time, anybody that suffered from addiction was ostracized. There was a stigma attached to them. If anything, I hope the opiate epidemic that showed that everybody from a white collar to a doctor, we've had every class of person addicted and die from opioid overdoses. Famous actors, famous musicians. At this time, if we realize it can touch everybody, we realize that every one of us that touches somebody can make a difference. I have a lot of friends. Those of you who don't know me, when I was in college, my hair was here. I have a lot of friends that grew up doing weed and smoking and stuff like that, and we still talk. We're still friends in some cases, because some are dead, some are gone. And they talk about that. They go, how did you ever make the transition? You're a party animal in college. How do you ever? I said, what did you do? And they said, I stopped doing everything. I go, I know. Would you like some of those years back? And what it is when we were growing up and somebody was doing drugs or somebody was wilder than we were, we sort of stopped seeing them. I had kids. I didn't see those people anymore. I wouldn't go into those parties anymore. Well, that's not the healthiest way when things can sneak up on you as fast as an opioid epidemic. I think you just have to care about people, talk to people. And if you yourself feel down or you're hurting, go to a doctor. Go to a friend. Go to a priest. Go to a teacher. And if somebody comes to you, you can't be afraid to talk to them. You can't say, well, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a drug person. Because most of the time, people need some love and care to help them negotiate a landscape in America that's beautiful. We have so many caring people in so many professions, in private industry, in public service, in faith-based services, that are so willing to share their hearts and their time. And for some reason, people are afraid to touch, to feel, to care. And so I think individually, just going out into the world and saying, if I come into contact with something I think is aberrant behavior, high-risk behavior, I'm going to say what I feel. We empowered a lot of people with anti-smoking campaigns. We had people, little old ladies that wouldn't say a word to anybody, go up to people and say, you're not supposed to smoke in here. We need to give people that power back again. And doctors will help us. Now, the people pretending they have anecdotal evidence that somebody's going to help you, watch out. That's advertising. The beer and the tobacco industries, every industry out there uses advertising to advantage. But you know what? If you buy Guess jeans instead of Levi's, you might spend more money, but it's not going to kill you, unless they're two sizes too small. But for the most part, make good choices. And when it comes to choices that can affect your life adversely, be real careful of even making those choices. I don't know. I can go on forever. You can put nickels in all day long. I am at drugfreeiowa.org, Peter at drugfreeiowa.org. Send me any emails and notes you want. Just to give you an indication, we also are sort of creating a large organization called Partnership for Healthy Iowa, because we do drug-free workplace, we do digital literacy trainings, we have a lot of other stuff. So, we're trying to evolve by looking at the landscape of these problems on a broader scale. We want the kids of Iowa to grow up and be healthier and have a better opportunity. How many of you are from small towns in Iowa? Okay. If you grew up around farming at all, you know how crazy farmers are about invasive weeds or a problem with their fields. I mean, we have in Iowa grown the highest yields of corn, beans, and we're doing great with cattle and hogs. I mean, we have taken acres and turned them into gold mines. We're known for raising these crops. What we're trying to change here and why it's so important, everything that you do, reintegrating the community and faith and education and medicine with real people, is the fact that we want the number one crop to be kids. If we paid the same attention to raising our kids and made the same investments as a farmer makes in an acre of land to get the most corn or beans, we would have the smartest and healthiest kids in the world. And that's how you deal with any threat to the well-being of a community, is to protect your children. And the guidelines you set for your children, believe in them for yourself. So if on Sunday you're preaching thou shalt not kill, don't let your kids play video games that kill stuff over and over again. You're going to have a hard time stopping them because they're addicted, more than likely. But stop the madness. Stop that crazy stuff and invest in good things. It's okay. Hey, you want to play computer games? Like, we've had kids that won't stop playing some computer games, and they're not all about killing. Instead of playing from their houses late at night separately, they get to at one person's house, set up all the computers. Much healthier. Watch TV that may be peripheral for young kids. If the family watches it together, guess what? Father and mother moderate. You know, that's a bad commercial. Or, you know, that's beer. They're really making it look good. It's not good. Parents need to take that responsibility. We shouldn't all be victims of the media and advertising. We should be smart consumers. We should have a healthy amount of skepticism. And that includes any drugs or medicines people give us, or vitamins they want to give us, or any miracle cures they want to give us. Any other questions out there?
All right, I want to thank you.
Wait, you got one more? Okay.
What are 2 or 3 things doctors can do or give to people who do not want to take opioids? For example, I broke 6 ribs last summer, and the doctor offered me a lot of stuff.
20, 30 years ago, we talked to a lot of doctors that treat pain, and they say what's really fascinating is that 20 or 30 years ago, before the opioid epidemic, before the opioids started being prescribed, they said people would, remember Grandpa with the gnarled fingers and all the arthritis and the pain they wake up with? They lived with pain. The whole thing about a culture living longer and doing more stuff increases pain. You want to know the great correlation of pain in people, especially people like me with bad knees? Weight. If your back hurts, your knees hurt, your feet hurt, and you're overweight, lose weight. It's the best medicine in the world. You know, they do that in the bike industry. I want to buy a new bicycle to ride in Ragbri. They say, for $2,000 more, you can save 4 pounds and 3 ounces and buy this graphite model. I said, I just don't go to Burger King tomorrow and I save 4 pounds, 3 ounces, save myself $3,000. You know, you got to become sort of smart consumers and not get sucked in by what people are saying. And doctors are learning that, and I think, I know you're working on stuff that's more holistic. Look at yoga, look at exercise. And doctors are starting to do this because part of pain treatment protocols 20 years ago involved much less medication and much more lifestyle. Because quite frankly, as we live longer, enjoy better lives, eat more foods, gain more weight, live a more sedentary lifestyle, you will have more pain. And then you can also get more pain if you don't do any of that stuff, but you can increase the statistical probability. So I think we're going to see a lot more about health. You know, we're looking at China, Japan, Eastern cultures that start the day with Tai Chi and exercise. We have a lot of people starting the mornings with yoga and other exercise. These are all strong contributors to good health and better pain management. Your body is better at managing pain when it has a level of fitness that's better. Thank you. Thank you all for sticking this long. And I'll be here if you have any questions. You can come down.
Thank you very much. We do want to let you know that we do have some activities for National Recovery Month, which is the month of September. So this Saturday, Community and Family Resources is hosting a 5K out at Ada Hayden Park. Everyone is invited. There's a $10 registration fee, or you can just come and join the fun for free. And then we also have Story County Mental Health Expo, which is coming up on Tuesday, September 25th. and that will be at the Iowa State University Memorial Union in Great Hall, and that's from 6 to 8:30. So we want to welcome all of you to both of those events. Have a great evening.